Controls user group. I think I've met most of you on the call. If I haven't met you, my name is Banesh Rajkaran. I run our PwC IT audit and SAP controls practice in the KZN region. Been at PwC for a long time. In fact, this year is 25 years at PwC. So in a way, you could say that I've been locked down at PwC for the last 25 years. I work primarily on business process and IT controls in SAP and non-SAP environments. I've also worked on a number of IT systems implementations, providing quality assurance and complex projects. Just some housekeeping announcements just to kick off, seeing that this is a virtual session. So firstly, the session is being recorded, so please note that. And the recording will be shared to you and other colleagues to listen back on, and will be distributed after the events once it's available. And just in terms of muting and your videos, if you wouldn't mind keeping your videos up for the duration of this, and also to be muted as well. There will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation. There's also the chat functionality. If you want to post any comments or questions, please welcome to use the chat functionality. That's the one, I think it's the fifth icon at the bottom. So you can send a message to everyone on the chat, and we'd encourage you to use that to try and make this as interactive as possible. But as I said, there will be time for questions at the end where you can unmute yourself and ask your questions or comment accordingly. If you are having any technical issues, please drop the host a note with your cell number. So the host in this session is Michelle. So please drop Michelle a note with your cell number, and we'll get someone to talk you through troubleshooting. Or alternatively, if you're able to do so, you can use the chat functionality and just chat to Michelle about what your issue is as well. So a little bit more background on these sessions. I think we've been having these sessions for the region of about 2 to 2.5 years now. Today's session is slightly different for a couple of reasons. So firstly, this is the first SAP Controls Group user forum in a virtual environment. Normally, this session takes place in a boardroom table. For obvious reasons, that isn't possible today, and we didn't want to push out the session any further. So I guess this is something that we'll have to get used to as part of this new normal. So this format might be the kind of right channel maybe for the next couple of meetings as well. The second difference on today's call is the number of participants we have today. So normally we have something in the region of maybe 12 to 15 participants in a very intimate setting around the board table. Today we're expecting about 25 to 30 people. And the reason for this large number of participants today is really the wide applicability of today's discussion topic. So today's discussion topic is not relevant only to SAP implementations teams who normally attend these, but also to controls and internal audit teams today working in a SAP environment as well. So on today's session, there are a number of CAEs or internal audit managers that will be joining for the first time. So welcome to you if you are joining the session for the first time today. I'm not going to ask us to kind of introduce ourselves as we normally do in these sessions, but what I am going to do is just maybe read out a list of the organizations that are being represented here today. So there are attendees from these organizations that are present on this meeting today. So there's a few people from Toyota. There's a couple of people from SPA as well, RCL, Guinea Water, Tonga Hewlett, City of Amsterdam, Mass Discounters, Transnet, Bell Equipment, and Safao. I think most of these organizations have had representatives at our past SAP user group meetings as well. So welcome back to all of you. So the agenda is on the screen at the minute. We're going to move into very shortly in terms of the actual presentation, which today is around the power of process mining to provide valuable insights. And that will be done by Dion and Inanda, and I'll introduce them in a couple of minutes' time. And we'll then move on to questions at the end. But as I said, if you have any questions or comments as you move around the session as well, please feel welcome to use the chat functionality and we can address them as we move along. Slight different to today's format for those of you that have attended before. Normally we have a session at the end, just going through the table to understand any SAP lessons learned and challenges. We've dropped that from the agenda today. It's a little bit difficult to manage in a virtual environment. And we'll look to bring that up in when we have the next physical session, which might hopefully be later this year. So just a few words on why we chose this topic for today's discussion. So today's discussion again is around the use of process optimization tools in the SAP environment, and we thought it's relevant for a couple of reasons. So firstly, there's still a couple of organizations in the middle of the SAP HANA implementations or the middle of the upgrades. And I also understand that some of you have yet to commence your upgrades as well. And in our view, we feel that process optimization and ensuring consistent business processes across different business units and making sure that best practice processes are kind of built into your blueprints as you start your implementation process. So we thought that would be relevant to those of you starting your implementation journeys. Secondly, from a control perspective, and I mentioned before that this would be relevant to the CAEs and internal audit colleagues on this call. So we're going to cover how can we use some of these process optimization tools from a controls perspective, and what are some of these possible use cases in order to automate traditional internal audit and controls work. So I think the asks from audit committees these days is to try and make more use or better use of data analytics tools. And today we'd like to show you a tool that has got many controls and audit connotations as well as implementation uses. And lastly, we're also aware that there's a few organizations that have completed their perhaps upgrade or implementation processes, and we feel that even where those implementation processes are complete, process optimization is sometimes needed to understand areas for improvement and amendments post-implementation in order to get the best return on investment from your SAP environment. Okay, so with that introduction, I'm going to introduce the two speakers today. I'm going to start off with Dion Heidenreich. Dion's a partner in our IT risk assurance practice. He's based in Joburg. He's got more than 18 years experience in delivering risk and control solutions, primarily in SAP environments. He's also had more than 10 years experience in Belgium and the UK as well. His particular areas of expertise include being engagement leader on multiple large multinational audit engagements in complex SAP environments. He also has experience with SAP security design, SAP GRC access controls and process controls, and SAP controls implementations, including several in SOX environments. He's also been delivering process insights through data analytics and process mining. And last but not least, very importantly, like me, he's a fellow Liverpool fan, and he's looking forward to football resuming again next week. So with him today is Nananda Lorenzo. Nananda is a senior manager, also based in our Joburg office. She's within our SAP specialist team. Nananda has been responsible for management of various information system audit projects. She works across many different industries. And more recently, Nananda has been heading various process mining projects on SAP systems. So as we commence the presentation, just want to remind you again to please use the chat functionality if you've got any comments and questions, and we'll address them as we move along. Dion, with that introduction, I'm going to pass over to you. Warm welcome to you. I believe it's a pretty chilly morning in Joburg today.
Hi there. Thanks, Banesh. Indeed, very chilly. And I apologize then for any Man U supporters, but that's life. That's 30 years of pain on my side. Good. Yes. So yeah, looking forward to taking you through these. I think what we want to do is how we're going to break down the session is first to talk a little bit about what process mining is and just sort of a bit of basic theory of how it works. It is a different type of data analytics. So it's not a classical, simple, we download some very specific data, look at a KPI and try and analyze the output. So I want to make sure that we sort of understand how it functions, how the tool functions. And then we'll take you through a demo. So those first two parts is really focused on making sure we all can see what the capability is of process mining. And then what will hopefully then be interesting, once we're all comfortable with what's sort of possible, we will take you through some use cases where we are definitely doing more and more work around using this capability to actually solve business problems, which I think is where it should become really interesting. So just one of my, so indeed, as Banesh said, I spent time in Belgium and the UK, and actually it's there that process mining sort of comes from. It was developed 10, 12 years ago by a Dutch professor in Eindhoven, who actually, in a very good way, sort of made it, shared the algorithms behind how it works, which meant that anybody can really take that and start developing a tool. So the concept, maybe Ninanda, if you can go to the next slide, we'll take you through what it's trying to achieve. But there are a number of tools out there that essentially make use of this concept. Celonis is sort of broadly defined as the leader in the market at the moment. So we've used some other tools in the past, but I'd say about 2 years ago, internationally, PwC formed a partnership with Celonis, as it was and still is today the sort of best in the market. So we'll talk about process mining as a concept, but we use Celonis as a tool. But there are other tools in the market as well, and I think it's a very competitive environment, which is good, because if I go back 3-4 years, it was still quite difficult and not intuitive, where it's becoming more and more intuitive and easy to use. So that's a good trajectory, and also at the moment quite specialized. So not the cheapest bit of software, but again, I'm hoping with all this competition and where this is going, that will become better. Right, to start off with, what is it fundamentally doing? So when you want to understand a process for various reasons, whether you want to improve a process, implement something in a system, do a process mapping. Traditional way would be mostly to maybe you get a few statistics out of the system, but you go and speak to the people in the process owner, and you sort of map out manually how that works. And if you're doing that step further, you might take single transactions and trace them through the system and essentially flowchart them, which is, I think, we all probably would have seen a lot and understand how that works. What that gives you is a relatively, very small sample based on a lot of the time people's input to a large degree. So it's not necessarily very objective, it's subjective and doesn't give you a full view. So you get this idea of a process, maybe you've identified a few streams, but it's relatively straightforward. The reality is, which you can see on the right-hand side there, is that in a system, and we'll see when we get to the demo, and it's fascinating when doing process mining for the first time, the reality isn't just a little bit more complex, it's vastly more complex. Often you might think there's 3 or 4 sub or streams in a process, and when you do process mining, you end up with, it can often be thousands of different iterations of how a process might work and how people might use. I know the first few times I ran this, I often show the output, and initially there's a disbelief saying, well, it can't be true. But this is data-based, it's objective, and the data doesn't lie. So it really is interesting the first time people see this, and you'll get an idea of a very typical environment when we do the demo today. So before we go on to the next slide, just I do believe any sort of process-related work, whether it be optimization, reviews, in the next 3 to 5 years, process mining will become the sort of default way of doing it. This is so much better and improved and becoming so practical that the traditional way of doing a walkthrough and speaking to people up front, I think, will slowly go away. So keen to share this and hear your views, but I think this will become extremely common over the next 3 to 5 years. Maybe go to the next slide, Ninanda. So just practical, how it works. So in any system, a system tracks what happens to every transaction. So, and we are going to be focused on SAP here. So SAP will, and we take a purchase to payables process. If you do a purchase requisition, it starts a transaction flow. So it knows, it creates that document, it gives a unique identifier to it. it knows the activity that it's going through, so it captures this as a purchase requisition. Maybe then it flows over to a purchase order that gets approved. Then it waits for the goods receipt. It waits for the invoice. It finally gets paid. So almost all systems who are dealing with business processes will have that sort of core functionality in place of, identifying the transaction, identifying which activity it's doing, the date it was done, and what values are associated with it as a minimum. So this exists in almost all systems. And maybe to mention here, when we're talking about Celonis and process mining, it is not SAP specific. You can use this across any system, as long as the system has those basic things that it's logging, which is very common in any business process system. What we then do is we extract that from the system, the relevant information for that business process, and we create what's an event log. And next slide, I'll talk a little bit more of the event log, but it essentially is capturing digitally what's happened to every single transaction that's flowed through the system. So it's not just taking a sample, we specify a time period, and for that period, we download every single transaction in that business process. Once we have the event log, that's a sort of basis, then the process mining happens. So that's where we're using the Celonis tool. As I said, there are other tools that you can use, and that's then essentially an advanced query and visualization tool that then allows us to in a visual way and a very powerful way, analyze that data. And that's really what the demo will be about, is looking at that sort of third and fourth step there, which we'll see. Go to the next slide. So just quickly to make sure, a little bit of terminology, and this will be the last technical slide. So the way it's built up is for every sort of stream of activities, we call that a case. So if I think of one purchase, starting with the purchase requisition, purchase order, to a goods receipt, invoice, and payment, that would be one case. And the case is obviously made up of a number of events that I've just mentioned that happens throughout that case. So that's essentially what goes into the event log, and that allows us then to analyze. Okay, I think that's one more slide. Just so very practically, what we always also do is when we're analyzing is we have some discussion about what would be the expected path, and it's often referred to as the happy flow. So what is the process supposed to be? And in this case, we can see here what are the different events that will happen in the process flow. Some of them are approvals. You could also you could put a few variations, but this is sort of put into the tool as the sort of expected flows, and then can be used obviously to benchmark to what degree is that being used, to what degree are there variations from that. A large part of the analysis is looking at unexpected variations, which is not what what the process owner would have necessarily expected. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor of what it is theoretically, but this is always much more interesting once we do this practically. So I'm going to hand over to Nanda now, and she'll take us through Celonis and a number of different dashboards, and essentially demonstrating what the power is of the tool in a real live situation. Nanda?
Thank you, Dion. So what we've got here is a very common view within Celonis. And what we've got is we've got the starting point of the process and the end. And this has been compiled by the tool based on the event log that we created and the activities which we've defined. And they've been placed chronologically based on the date stamps that are associated with those activities. We've got the number of cases, so how many of those items are flowing through each of these activities. So one of the first things one would want to do as part of trying to understand the process is maybe to add one or two of these activities to see what else is taking place in the process. I don't know if I should maybe drop off my camera.
The fun of a live demo. This didn't, of course, happen yesterday afternoon when we tested it.
The burpees, yeah.
Let's just see. I wonder if it's not my F11 here. Check. Let me just quickly double check this. Okay. Dion, I guess it's a good thing we've got a backup slide deck. Let's quickly see if everyone can see the screen. Okay, is that visible? Dion?
Yep, we can.
Well, so yeah, hopefully we can get the live demo up again, but otherwise, yeah, let's just take through the slides.
Okay. So we've had the end-to-end activities, and then the next step I was very eager to do was to include 2 of these activities. So what we can see here is that we have a purchase order, one additional activity was approved, another one potentially is a goods receipt. With the flows, with the arrows, it's also indicated that a certain number of activities did not go through an approval process, or potentially no goods receipt was captured. Another option that we can use is to look at what the flows are. So should it maybe flow through the purchase order, or are there perhaps situations where it flows to a different activity? Ultimately, if we had to expand all of the activities in the process, this is thankfully still a very elementary process, not that many activities, but it starts to become a bit more messy. And similarly, when we include all of those connections, it gets extremely messy. And from an understanding perspective, this is chaos. To try and understand all of these, to work through all of these connections are very time consuming, and one would probably want to rather focus your efforts on those that are more important.
And just to add there, that is not an uncommon view. Almost every single process, if you add all activities, all connections, this is very typical what we see. So this is what surprises people, that the process they think they understood has this much complexity.
Agreed. So this view is also a very nice one that we use to just start analyzing the process. Just looking at it from the most common variant, so what is the most common flow in the process, and just to walk through it step by step, look at additional, including more of those variants, just to start seeing what's actually happening and taking place. So in this view, we've got 254,000 purchase order items. We've got the net value of those purchase orders, and we see that the process is actually an average of 6 steps. So immediately you start with what I'm seeing 4 on the screen. So what are those 2 other events? And that's maybe something to explore to understand why my most common flow is not necessarily representative of the average steps across the population. And next we have a duration of 66 days end to end for the process. So depending on your organization or the type of process you are analyzing, this might give you an idea whether you are on track or whether you're meeting any KPIs within your entity. Looking at the bottom right, this is one of 4,433 variants. Variants being the different ways in which an item could flow through the process. This is also subjective in terms of how many activities you commonly have, but in this case, this is actually a fairly high number, and one would want to have that as low as possible, and to optimize the process. However, looking at how many cases this flow is covering, so 23% of those documents do follow this process, which is a fairly good number. What I did here was to increase the second step in the process. So what happened was we got an additional arrow indicating that the starting point is actually not the purchase order, but that the items start and they go to a vendor where the vendor created the invoice. So this activity, the timestamp is taken from the invoice date that the vendor prints on that invoice. So when an invoice gets captured in the system, that information is also captured. After the vendor creates the invoice on their side, the entity internally creates the purchase order and it becomes an invoice and it gets paid. So if we can just pause on this one a little bit, from a controls compliance angle, this means that someone instigated or initiated that purchase with the vendor, whether it be via email or telephone, before they captured anything within the system. So at the moment, we also don't see any approval, so let's assume it's under the minimum approval level. But from a control and compliance perspective, this is considered to be maverick buying. And there was actually a significant number of these cases within this process that we had discussed with a client, and it was a big revelation in the room to say this is a bad behavior that's actually pervasive across the process or across the organization. And this buying behavior then means even if there is approval, the approval is after the fact. The goods are probably delivered and we're quickly capturing everything on SAP because we cannot pay the vendor without going through the process starting at the purchase order. So,
Nanda, sorry, going back to your previous point,
yes.
because you're not doing it on a sample basis, in that case, you can kind of confirm all of the transactions that are the exceptions and basically do some stats around that in terms of the values, etc. So it's not a sample base, it's the total transaction that you can then report.
Most definitely. And go do some sort of a deep dive and understanding what could be the root cause for that behavior. So if we had to expand our variants up to about 12, so 12 variants out of the 4,000, we've actually already covered 70% of the cases. So using this view, one can get that understanding of at least 70%, follow the flows, see what happens, what changes, what additional activities potentially take place in the process. If we go back to the most basic, the most common flow, number one, and what I did here was I switched the view from the number of cases to what is the throughput time. So using those timestamps from our event log, what are exactly the duration between, what's the average duration between these activities? And something that maybe pops out, it's nice and big and bold, is 56 days between capturing the invoice on the system and making that payment. Again, company dependent. This could be within line of expectations or not. So this view that we have here is an analysis of your throughput time. So if we look here, we've got the invoice receipt activity to the clearing activity. And on average, it's 46 days. So for the full process, 46 days on average. And we've got a bit of an aging here to see how many cases are actually sitting within that 46-day bucket or potentially even longer. And we have the opportunity to go and filter for those that are more than our expected, let's say 60 days, and deep dive to see what are those cases, which vendors does it relate to, is it perhaps a certain type of material, or could it be internal, where it's a user within our organization. When we spoke with a client, they mentioned, well, you know, we've really worked on this and we've actually improved. And we said, that's not a problem, let's take a look. So we then filtered for the 2018 events, and we the average throughput time was 51 days. However, if we look at 2019, it changed to 36 days. So 51 to 36, definitely an improvement on that activity. And in that way, one can do a pre and post analysis and run this tool maybe before, analyze what are your key points that you would like to improve, what are those areas one would like to focus on, and then execute the tool again later and do a comparison to see have we actually achieved those efficiencies, improvements, and control compliance.
And I assume that analysis can also be done across different business areas or divisions and also geographical areas as well, to just do a comparison and understand some that might be best in class and maybe some that might be lagging, and therefore identify improvement opportunities in those organizations.
Most definitely, Ganesh, and taking those elements from the best in class process or areas or business units and then rolling that out to the rest of the organization. We do have another great view where we can do those side by side and do that benchmarking. So I'll get to that. This is another view that we use to understand the process and also to see whether we are complying. So from a controls perspective, how many of the cases that flow through the process are actually complying with our expectation? And what is that expectation? That expectation was this happy flow that Dion had on his slide deck as well. So if I can quickly discuss this, we're talking about a purchase requisition, which was optional in this demo. There had to be a purchase order. Depending on the approval levels, it was also an optional activity to have approval take place, but then we required a goods receipt, invoice receipt, and clearing. So the conformance view takes all of the cases and measures it against this happy flow that we've stipulated. And based on that, it came up with the metrics to say that 60% of your cases are actually complying with this process. So one would then want to go and look at what are those other 40%. What it also does is to highlight for you where there are any violations. So violations would also be defined based on this happy flow. Either one of these activities do not take place, the sequence of events between activities are different, or potentially additional activities are occurring in your process, for example, updating of the purchase order items. So just quickly hopping back, in this situation we had the 60% conforming cases. There were 30 violations that we also found in the process. Looking at those violations, so interesting enough, the violations actually decreased the throughput time to 62 days compared to 68, potentially because we're shortcutting or we are bypassing some of the steps within the process. However, the steps were more. So there are 7 steps on average compared to the 4.8 where there is compliance. We can then look at the first 2 that are highlighted for us here. The first one being that the PO item gets updated. So in our happy flow, that was not a defined activity because we don't want there to be any updates made. It increases inefficiencies in the process, and it could also highlight for us there might be a problem. We don't have up-to-date information on our pricing from the vendors, or what are those reasons for making the updates. The second one we have there is approved is followed by invoice receipt. So I'm going to quickly skip back to our happy flow. We see approved activity is followed by invoice receipt. So it's actually highlighting for us that the goods receipt activity is missing because the case goes from approved to invoice receipt. So here we've delved deeper into that violation where approved is followed by invoice receipt. And what we see with the time that we've, let's say the time representation that we've got here, is that there was a fair increase during 2018, but from 2019 Feb onwards, there were hardly any violations. And what happened in this case was that the SAP configuration got updated, that there is a compulsory requirement for a goods receipt to be captured before we can continue with the process. And this graph clearly highlighted that for us. The other one was the top one we looked at, which said there's an update being made to our purchase order item. So 20% of our cases actually have this violation, and it seems to be fairly pervasive across the flow. So our data ended here around May, June, therefore the decline, but for the most part, there were quite a few updates being made. And updates definitely indicating some sort of inefficiencies in the process, and we also like to talk about the fact that it's considered to be rework. So for rework, we have a nice dashboard that we look at to say, what is the rework? What is actually now happening and what kind of activities are taking place? If we look at the left-hand side, it's telling us that of all our cases, all our items that flow through the process, 46% of those, almost 50%, almost half, where a rework activity is taking place. That is something that's maybe, for me, that's quite concerning. What is happening? What are they doing? Are they trying to manipulate anything from a control side? Or is it somebody is not trained and they're not capturing the purchase order item? So what is causing that? The 8% talks about activities. So rework activity, so a PO item update activity, for example, there's not that many different activities compared to all the other ones taking place in the process, which means there's not that much for us to go and analyze, which is quite the benefit. So average steps, here we've got an average of 8 steps, where previously we had that average of 6 steps. So immediately you see it increases the work that's required in the process, and the duration was also increased now to 70 days instead of the 66 days.
So Nina,
yes,
you're talking about the rework. I think that's also becomes quite important when organizations are going through their implementation processes. And I referred to earlier on when they're doing their blueprints, it's important to probably look at these rework and understand the root causes behind them in order to try and eliminate them. Otherwise, you have the danger in the implementation process of taking these things or these inefficiencies forward into your new project as well, or your new system.
Fantastic point, Banesh. And you know, is it maybe then functionality within your new system that could solve the problem, or is it an interface, or what is the root cause? You know, one needs to then dive down and make sure that you're not bringing the bad behavior across, and that should there be 5 steps staff need to take to fix something, that we can decrease that effort required. The other parts on the left-hand side that I'm going to touch on quickly is we've got a little space to play with. In this case, we said very cheaply, it takes me 3 minutes to do a rework activity, and it costs the company 50 Rand per hour to pay me to do that they pay me. So it comes up to 101. But if we had to add a few zeros to that 50 Rand per hour, that cost increases quite significantly. So if we look at the top, I'm not sure if you can see my little mouse, but if we look past the process flow and we look at the graph called defined rework activities, here we can see on a bit more granular level what is being updated. And lo and behold, it's amounts. On the PO item, they're updating the amounts. So from the purchase order to the invoice, we can't process the invoice because we have a discrepancy between what the amounts are, what the supplier is charging me. So for me, that immediately raises some flags. Is our information out of date? Is the supplier potentially not charging us in line with contract values that we've agreed? You know, so that definitely is something to go and look at. Secondly, we are changing quantities. So are we over-delivering, under-delivering, and we're going to change the PO to match up with the invoice and goods receipt note instead of raising a credit note or maybe just matching up the second delivery that could come through. And then over time, if we look at the top right graph, we can see there was a bit of a spike and a lull, but overall that relates to the activities percentage. There is, you know, we would like to bring that down, definitely much lower than what it's currently sitting at. So sticking with the activities, we want to now go and unpack this purchase order item that got updated. So this is a lovely representation of the volumes that go through each of those events. And here at the bottom left, it's starting to turn more purple than the scary pink. We've got the PO item updated. When I go into that activity, I can then see which are the users that have been doing that activity. And one of the big ones that are popping out, that are updating invoices, if I had to look at warm-bodied users, is Mochirisim. Anyway, so we've got this chap here. And the next thing we can do is deep dive into his profile. What is he doing on the system? When we look at his profile, what we are seeing is the PO item updates. Is this person do they maybe need to get some training because they are going and making updates on the PO? However, they don't seem to be capturing the purchase order. They are mostly capturing goods receipts and invoice receipts. So when that invoice lands on his desk or the goods receipt, he then goes and updates the PO item to match up with what was received. From a controls perspective, are we okay with this? Are we not okay with this? Especially not okay with this because he is doing what we would consider two conflicting activities of capturing the invoice receipt and the goods receipt. And in essence, being able to go and force balance and make it work. Instead of flagging and creating credit notes or anything, they could have potentially delivered a little bit less, or they could have delivered more. I pocket some of the goods because I'm doing the goods receipts. I go update the PO to match this, or whatever the case may be. There's this opportunity for someone to cook the books. So let's go see. From a segregation of view, we've put in here to say people who are capturing a goods receipt and the invoice receipt. And this scary 77% is the violation. That's the number of cases where the same user was capturing both the goods receipt and the invoice receipt. And I see it's not sorted here, but our little superstar that we identified earlier, he's actually sitting with the highest number of purchase order items that he's capturing both the goods receipt as well as that invoice receipt. And from a controls perspective, this is something we want to identify and flag. In our traditional audit methodology, we could only look at who was given the access, who had the ability to do both of these activities. Whereas with process mining, we then bring the actual transactions that transpired, and we can then marry those two pieces of information to say, you've got 10 staff members that have the ability to capture both goods receipts and invoice receipts. And well, on a quick look, it's almost all of them are actually doing that. So the hypothetical risk has actually realized, which is sometimes a lot of the argument to say, but we are just thinking this is a potential. Did it really take place? And yes, it did. So much so that in this instance, they created a central function at head office to do the invoice capturing, to take away the segregation of duty conflict. And lastly, probably the flagship view that we would like to use that can really bring insight into your organization, whether it's cross countries, across companies or areas, or any sort of segmentation that you want to view them as. And we put them next to each other. And what we see here is you've got two purchase organizations within the same entity. Probably the one on the right-hand side does about half the volumes, but actually at a higher value. So not somebody to disregard in that sense because they are processing such large values. If we look at purchase organization 1000 on the left, okay, 50 days. We did see that on average it's 66 days, so they're definitely doing better than the organization as a whole. But then looking on purchase org 1001 on the right-hand side, 88 days. That's significantly more than what we have as a purchase organization, which already, as an organization as a whole, which we already would like to decrease. So clearly on this right-hand side, there are some inefficiencies that we want to pinpoint, which is not taking place on the left-hand side. And then considering automation. So how we define automation would be based on a user. So if you have machine learning or a bot that is processing transactions, we would then define that bot and say, okay, well, we can see there is more automation taking place on the left-hand side, which could contribute to our fantastic 50-day lead time compared to the zero automation on the right with our 88 days of lead time. So I know it's small. I will just maybe highlight to you what we can see here. So if we look on the left-hand side, the process is very much how we had it in the first view, where we had the process start, we had the purchase order, the vendor creates the invoice, there's a goods receipt, the invoice, and it gets paid. We're very happy with that. That main process variant, the most common flow is 46 days. If we then compare to what we've got as the most common flow on the right-hand side, immediately we've got maverick buying taking place. The purchase order, there's multiple approvals, so this big amounts are going through multiple approvals. So chances are the left-hand side, no approvals there, but it's probably smaller amounts underneath our threshold. So we've got the approvals taking place from a control side. That's definitely something we would like to see. There's some release to that approval. They're also doing goods receipt, invoice receipt, and clearing. But potentially this maverick buying habit is causing a bit of a problem. And considering that it's taking place on such significant amounts within our business, that is a concern that the goods are arriving and nobody gave pre-approval within our process and within the controls and confinement of what we want to look at. So we said you can benchmark here, you can benchmark two companies against each other, purchase organizations. You can flip it to say what material groups or vendors, you can even benchmark your vendors against each other. You can build in any of the KPIs that you would like to monitor. And from efficiency perspective, let's take the best learning from one site and go and apply it to the other site before we do any migrations or before we take all of these inefficiencies with us into our new system. Banesh, Dion, I think that was my last one. Any other comments?
No, I think it's good. Let's move on to how can we use that. And Ninanda, thank you very much, and also very glad you did keep a good set of screenshots. So thanks a lot for handling that. Okay, so let's run through not too many slides, but I want to just make sure we share with you how we're seeing that, what sort of business value can this drive and which areas can we use this. So just quickly a summary slide I won't spend on, but this is just if you can see the capability. So clearly a lot of value in terms of process discovery and understanding the design of the process, what's really happening, what are all the variations happening. And then when you benchmark and look and start analyzing that, you can start getting an idea what are the good practices that you can apply, but also where are obviously some of the bad practices. How much rework, where might there be opportunities for automation, whether it be better configuration or robotics, but also organizational analysis, understanding who is doing what in the system, whether it be from a controls perspective, so segregation of duties, but also just who's spending a lot of time doing a lot of the activities. Can that be reduced? Can that be automated? Can we find efficiencies? Understanding which of your users are spending a lot of time in the system. So that's just a quick summary, as a few points on that, but clearly this provides us a huge amount of knowledge and insight in the process. So I think the obvious question is, well, how can we use this? So go to the next slide, Ninanda. So the first, I want to run through 3 or 4 sort of classic areas. The first one I want to just touch then is first from a sort of assurance compliance point of view. I know I'm been implementing and piloting this over the last year, both as part of internal audits, but also on our external audits. So we just take a sort of a classic audit life cycle. So first, from a planning and a risk assessment point of view, understanding the process flows much better up front, the volumes, who the users are, and using it to form a first risk analysis, so that before you go and start your audit, you actually understand the typical flows. You can prepare, what questions, what risk areas you want to focus on, where there are seemingly anomalies that you want to take. So you can obviously plan a whole lot better before you hit the ground. Imagine going to sit with your auditee. You're not sort of coming with a blank piece of paper or last year's file. You're saying, well, I've looked at what's happening in your process over the last 6 months. Let's talk through that and let's understand what's happening. Then once we get to the actual execution and the testing part, so you can see there's, we have a lot of standard analysis and analytics we can do. I think one of the most interesting and enjoyable things for me to do here is this is a very fact-based objective view. Often when you're discussing processes and you're talking about a conceptual, this is the configuration, etc., in a system, it becomes very debatable and it's not so tangible. Where, as you can see from the demo, this is extremely tangible. I mean, we didn't do the live, but if you have a specific question, you can immediately click, drill through, and see the exact transaction or set of transactions that forms this. So it allows for a much more interactive, intense, and you get to the answer so much quicker than what you traditionally would have done. It's an hour workshop. It's amazing how you move from I didn't know that to okay, here's my list of transactions. Okay, those make sense, those don't. So that sort of fact-based, transparent discussions is really valuable. We can obviously see where are the controls working, where not, when we analyze that. And quick to find the non-compliance and compliant areas. So from an assurance point of view, we can say that part of the process is working well, so you can provide the assurance and focus in on where's the real problems in a very quick way. So the traditional way of testing 20 purchases and then maybe I find 2 exceptions and now raise an issue, this becomes so much more focused as to this is exactly what's happened. These are the number of transactions. This is the flow it's following, and this is the quantification. This is the value. If we took the segregation of duties one there, I'm not saying theoretically these 5 people can do both. No, here are the people that did both. This is the value of what they did. This is the risk. So it becomes much more tangible and focused. If we move on to then reporting, so clearly there's strong visualization in here. So whether you do it live, I've actually done a few presentations of this live to an audit committee, and the interaction and the interest from senior execs and audit committees is absolutely amazing. Usually people have this very high level reporting and a high level understanding. So this very quickly you can run through their process in 20-30 minutes, and they actually have a real idea of what's happening on the ground, and they might not have had that understanding. So the ability to show what is often highly complex processes in a strong, easy way towards stakeholders is really, really good. And again, quantifying that risk, benchmarking between processes, locations, very, very powerful. And then from a follow-up closeout perspective, we showed there, we might find an issue, good receipt isn't always required. The config gets changed. Now, again, from an audit point of view, you'd want to know, well, has that really been implemented? From when? So instead of, again, just asking people and trying to validate in some manual way, you just rerun the same, you get the new data download, rerun the same queries, and you can see, yes, it is actually addressed now. We can see the transactions are not complying, or no, it's not. So it's a very quick and a much more comprehensive way to make sure that improvement plans actually have been implemented. So that's a huge amount of benefits, I think, from an assurance compliance point of view. And in those audit groups, I'm working with a few which needs to be redeveloping how they're going to do audit, a lot of pressure on digitizing the audits. I think this capability can make a huge difference and the value it brings to the audit committee. Okay, so this mainstream is what we're doing quite a bit on is process optimization. So really from we want to, outside of audit, but really from a business owner point of view, how can we improve the process? So the first box there, I think we've covered most of this, which is the analysis phase you do. But what can come out of this, and what we've seen in some of the process optimization areas we've done. So firstly, purely from an operational process excellence point of view, eliminating many of those non-standard processes. What we often find is not all the departments are following the process right. They're not all efficient, not following the best. So really, you saw there was 4,000 variants. To cut that down to here are the 10 or 20 variants that should be used, and eliminating all those non-standard ones creates a huge amount of efficiency gain in the process. Looking at reduction in days required on average. So looking at rework, so clearly using this to understand root causes of inefficiencies in the process, and then attacking those root causes creates a huge amount of time and freedom, so that people can stop spending so much time on where the process is clearly inefficient. And understanding where are their poor performance, whether it be suppliers, what part of the process isn't working well, what would we want to improve and set as targets, helps then create that operational excellence in the process. The third area is control and compliance. We've touched on, from an audit point of view, obviously the sort of classical controls, but also if you think of just payment terms, and saying I'm supposed to be paying people in this time, and that's how I'm maximizing discounts. Am I really achieving that? And actually finding that not everybody is necessarily following and achieving those objectives for the company. Making sure that all your approvals are efficient, it's being done at the right levels, you're not over amounts of approvals, or everything is approved. So those are all things that can help with the controls and compliance. And that what we also have done is, when you start macro analyzing the numbers, so for instance, you're looking at your payment policies, so you can see what is currently the case, but then you step back and you ask yourself, especially in an environment like we are at the moment, is that optimal? Can I actually change my payment terms, and therefore gain quite a bit of working capital improvement? So from that perspective, we can say, strategically, is my process working as optimally as I want? The other interesting thing we've linked up is SAP licensing. Obviously, is quite complex. Many different types of licenses, and those licenses carry different costs. And so that's making some broad assumptions about how the users are using. So if a user might have a full license, which costs quite a bit, but in actual fact only performing one activity, it could be much more efficient that they go onto a lower user license. So we're also using this output to identify, does this link up to your SAP user licensing, and is there ways in which we can optimize the types of license different users have with this output? Good. Maybe the next use case I think Banesh has touched on is within an S/4HANA or any system implementation upgrade. What are the sort of key areas where this can be beneficial? So what we see is, in the pre-implementation space, to gain a real good understanding of your as-is situation, and whether or not you use that to already fix some of the problems before you go on an S4 journey, so that the implementation will be easier on the organization, or whether you simply use that to fully understand all the variants that you need to build into your S4 solution. So in the pre-imp stage, it can be massively beneficial to take as an input into your design phase. And then once you get into your design phase to do the template development, so that input can therefore be used to develop your template properly, to make sure it will address all the different scenarios, because what we sometimes see is you weren't aware of some of the weird scenarios that may be required, and then once it goes live, then suddenly not everything is possible, because not everybody thought of all the different scenarios. But also through the testing, you can then use this to make sure that when you do the test data through your design phase, that it is in actual fact working like you were supposed to. And very helpful in the go live, in the immediate go live afterwards, if you would do this, let's say on a week or a monthly basis, with the hypercare phase, to make sure that people are actually using the system as you intended, or are there already deviations? And that deviations could be because people aren't trained right. Things get stuck. So instead of just waiting for a ticket to be logged and maybe somebody raises the problem, you can get much more real-time focus on where are the problems in your go live, and target them. Is it a problem that the config isn't, the solution isn't delivering, or is it a case of somebody's not trained? But they can be much more proactive to focus on where are there things stuck in the process, and fix that. And that hopefully, if you've used that throughout, the aim would be that this can really drive that you have a high adoption, acceptance, and from a change management point of view, you really achieve the outcome you wanted on your implementation. So we see this as a really good capability, again, that will strengthen the success of S4 implementations. And just the last slide I have is just some other ones. I don't want to dig too much, but there's obviously other areas. We mentioned process benchmarking. Maybe the second one there, I did a few consulting assignments where I helped clients who wanted to either implement a shared service center where they had different parts of the organization. And I remember the one I was doing, everybody said that their processes were best. So what we did is we used process mining to analyze each organization, saw how the process really flows, and took best in class from the different areas to design how would a shared service functionality work. But also, as you can imagine, shared service centers can get quite complex, especially when the shared service center isn't able to deal with each part of the entity in an exact standard way. So you can start analyzing all the different ways in which it's dealing with it and see, well, where do you need to focus to standardize and get more efficiency out of your shared service center? So a few other ones there, continuous controls monitoring. There are organizations looking at using this tool and capability to almost daily update the data so that they can daily get alerts where non-compliance is happening. As you can see from a user point of view, we can see who's using the system in what way, so that can be an input into your strategic workforce planning. If you want to really look at how you utilizing your workforce, you can identify training needs. And also when you're designing or redesigning authorizations, if you're doing a project along those lines, as you can see, this is looking at who has really done segregation of duties. So this can be a key input when you're designing your roles and profiles as to where should you be thinking, do I potentially have segregation of duties issues? How should I be dealing with that? Whether it be, am I going to allow that and have compensating controls, or am I going to clean that up and actually remove the access so that people can't do this? So those are some of the sort of key use cases we're seeing in the market, and we think can be in the really this capability can help a lot in terms of driving more value, because these are huge, expensive implementations. As you all will know, SAP is not cheap. And this can really help the organization tangibly see and focus on quick wins. Where can they improve and get more value out of the SAP system?
Thanks, Dion. I'm just going to check in on questions. There have been a couple of questions that have come through on the comments, so I'll read a couple of them, and maybe Dion and Ananda, you can address them.
Yeah,
so there's one.
First one, can you process analyze POs outside of contract agreements for both goods and services? So this can, I think this can analyze anything that's in a system. So I think there's both the pro and a con. So so we often pull in Ariba data in the purchasing process. If it runs across application, it can be mapped into. So first of all, if it's in a system, we can map it in and create part of the process. I think that the important limitation is if somebody's doing something manually outside the system, so on a spreadsheet, that won't necessarily be able to be pulled in. So that's where the consideration needs to be. Often that's a focus point of why is that part being done manually, and can that be automated? Yeah, so I think that addresses the second question as well. So as long as it's in a system, it can definitely be tracked across systems. So this is so the key thing is to pull the data from the system, understand the data you need, and then map it into the event log. And once you got it in the event log, you can put information from this different systems together, and then you use Celonis to analyze the end-to-end process. So that is definitely one of the strengths. I think in the SAP environment, it's often what you want is the core information sitting in SAP. I am also working in a few financial services environments where it's much more disparate systems across a process, and then we start pulling data in from many processes to build the end-to-end view. But this is one of the strengths here, is this can be used to get a true end-to-end view, which you might have a new dashboard. I think we can open it up if anybody wants to ask more questions. I think we shared a lot of information, so I don't know if there's any questions from the group.
Thanks, John. So any other questions? And you're welcome now to, if you would like to unmute yourselves and ask your question. Suzanne, I'm just going to ask. I know you had a question there. You happy that's been answered, or you want to maybe elaborate a little bit more? Suzanne?
So I think, can you hear me, Binesh?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hello. Yes. So just yes. So I do understand that it answer it, and I think maybe that's what to identify those items that are actually outside the system, and that's how you can promote automation and enhancement of the process. So that does make sense. So my next question would be how quick does it take to actually in your experiences so far, Dion, how long did it take to start this process, getting the template information into Celonis to actually get it, what duration was that type of project?
Yeah, so I think there's an important input here. So what you're essentially doing is you creating, so that event log we had at the slide is a very important step. So that's the key time constraint. So that's basically the things you need to understand is when you target the systems you want is to understand the data model in the system. So you need to understand where there's a data set that explains to you the transactions, the events, the timestamp. Now, in an SAP environment, we know that, so that part is easy. The second step is then to build your sort of framework that you put in your, so which are all the events that can possibly happen. And to give you a flavor, SAP is a complex environment. So we showed you the purchase to payables process there with 6 to 8 events. Technically speaking, there is just over 50 different types of events that can happen in a purchasing process. So in the back end, we need to cater for that. So we need to build a framework. Now, in purchase to payables, in sales and distribution, so some of the standard process flows in SAP, we've done that. So that doesn't take a lot of time, other than we have to consider any customizations in your environment. So if I were to do a purchase to payables in SAP, we can probably get a first dashboard out in a few weeks, depending on how quickly we can extract the data, how much customization, but we can get that pretty quickly. And once we have it in Celonis, then it becomes the value to start analyzing. And honestly, we've shown you the core functionalities to analyze. There is hundreds of ways you can analyze. So analysis paralysis is also a thing we've been learning over the past year, 18 months. We've been doing this to focus on certain areas. I think we're getting much faster. That compared to, let's say, you have a highly customized module, and we have to build that. It can take, it probably can take easily a month to first build the framework. And that's many data analytics. That's the challenge. Is the first time you do it, you might need to build the framework. But again, once you've done it once for a process, to rerun it then becomes exceptionally quick, because then everything is in place. You know where the data is. You just read out the same data. And once we've done something, once we've automated it, so we upload the data again, and then you can have the output can be, in a few days you can have the updated output again. So we've been requested and been doing a lot of work in the purchasing process. So we're pretty good in the SAP environment, and also have been doing it with Ariba and Coupa. So we got those understandings. But yeah, if it's the first time we're seeing, let's say you've got another system dealing with your purchasing and we have to map that in, that would take a bit more time.
Okay.
Dion, and maybe related to that point, how technical is it to use, and how much technical knowledge you need to have beforehand in order to be able to use this, and for an organization that's trying to set up internal capability on process optimization, how easy is this for them to embed in their organizations?
Yeah, there's easier and more difficult. So the technical back end side, to set it up can be quite complex. You need quite a bit of different skills. So you need obviously need technical data skills to do data transformation, so data science type skills, SQL, that sort of programming type skills. You need to understand process as well, and in order to, so that whole process to find the data, understand how the data, and then structure it to create the event log. That's quite specialized data skills. Celonis as a tool is actually very intuitive. And so there's good training that Celonis gives as part of that. And so once you have an event log to train somebody up, or a business user, or anybody to use Celonis, I think, and that's one of the things that's really improved a lot in the last few years. The earlier tools were not nearly as intuitive, and you had to have a sort of a data background to run queries. It was much more technical. But this has become very intuitive, very easy, and you can train somebody quite quickly to use Celonis as the analysis tool. So I'd say when you're setting up a new process, that takes quite technical skills. But once you've set it up once, then you can automate the extraction, the creation of the event log, and the analysis can be taught to anybody, whether an internal auditor, a business process owner. It's very quick to train somebody in those areas.
Great, thanks, Dion. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, it's Mark here. Just a question on the Celonis licensing. Would you have the licenses, or would you expect us to procure licenses for Celonis?
Yeah. So the way we handle it, we have got a agreement with Celonis, and so we get a set of licenses. So when we do the work and provide the output, then we're using our licenses. So that's fine. So that's when we do the analysis and we give the output to you. But obviously that's sitting on our environment. So where we are limited at the moment is we can't, you can't take it over because it's sitting on our environment. So if you want to also be able to do the analysis yourself and have it in your environment, then obviously you would have to set up the system and the licensing. So if we assist you, we have a platform, we have licenses, and we can use that. So that would you wouldn't carry any licensing costs in that case. And yes, it is important. This is not the cheapest bit of software out there. There are cheaper other software out there, but we just found Celonis is the one that really gives us all the value. As I said, what I hope is over time, with the competition, the licensing costs do go down. There's a lot. There's probably, I'd say, at least 20-25 vendors who are actively working on improving their process mining capability. So I'm hoping that means that we'll have better and better and cheaper licensing. But right now, Celonis is, they're pretty much the best, but they're also quite expensive.
Thanks for that, Mark. Any other questions? Okay, great. So I think if you think of any other questions later, you're more than welcome to send a mail to myself or Michelle, and we'll get those answers back to you. So maybe just to sum up on that presentation, then I think if you are interested and if you do see potential uses in your organization, I think we more than happy to do tailored presentations based on the specific use cases back in your organizations. As Dion said earlier on, Celonis is fairly new in SA. It's being used extensively in Europe. And in our view, I think in the next 2 to 3 years, this will be the way that process optimization will be done going forward. I think we're happy to present this back to your C-suite, your CIOs, CEOs, if you're doing implementations, alternatively, CAEs or CFOs, if you want to use this from a control perspective, including a demo of the tool as well. I know the demo didn't work quite today, but we'll happy to do that in a personal presentation back to your organizations. I just want to appeal to you as well. I think if you are doing implementations, if you're on your implementation path, to please consider something like this. As I said before, it provides an excellent input into your 2B templates to ensure that your current process inefficiencies, whether it's in P2P or OTC, they don't get carried forward into your blueprints and hence into your new system as well. So thanks, Dion. Thanks, Nanda, for that. Before we close, our next session, which we plan to have maybe in 3 to 4 months' time, and our next session will cover Concur. So Concur, we have talked about it previously on these sessions, is an intelligence expense and travel booking system. We do plan to get Suzanne Havilal, who's with us today on the call. Suzanne is the project manager at Toyota, who's in the implementation at the moment. So I want to give Suzanne a couple of minutes just to talk about that as a bit of a teaser in terms of what the experience is, with a view to having that as topic for the next SAP user group. So Suzanne, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a quick 2-minute conversation on your experiences with Concur.
So good morning to everybody else on the call. So just to give you a bit of insight into this project around April 2019, just to onboard and basically get approval. And then this was quite a robust project project with lots of different challenges that we had to do. So we started officially our analysis and design and so forth in around August, and by January we had our system ready. So quite challenging, and this was also probably helped us in the long run get ready for COVID, because this entire project was remote led. So we had to work off Skype and a bit of Teams and so forth, and exciting, but we got it done ready for January, and then we once we go live with our pilot group in February, and then of course along came the travel ban, which put a halt to things. So I'm hoping that by the time we've got to our next user group, Binesh, that we actually would have started traveling again, and then we can actually share the journey as well as, you know, where we are at that point. But just to give you an indication of some of the powerful, you know, solution functionality that we got is we managed to actually integrate right from a paper-based process in terms of requesting travel, right to then end-to-end traveling, and then sending our expense reports right into our SAP system. So quite a seamless end-to-end process. Quite exciting for us, but challenging, and hopefully I can share that journey with you at the next user group.
Great. Thanks very much for sharing that, Suzanne. Look forward to the next session. So just to conclude then, just a couple of points. Apologies, I do believe that there were some technical difficulties with some of you logging in, and it took some while, and I think there was maybe just a password issue of a space in the password. Apologies for that. I do believe that some of you were having sound issues, so we'll have a look at just a debrief on that. Feedback forms, there will be feedback forms that Michelle will be sending to you. If you can please complete that. It won't take you a long time. It'll just take you a minute to complete that. It gives us a good indication of how we should host these meetings in coming months, and also suggestions for future topics. So you'll see that in your inbox either today or Monday. If you don't mind completing that and sending that back to us. So thanks for attending. If you need to contact us, the contact details are in the invitation. You can contact Michelle or directly myself, Dion and Ananda. And as I said as well, if you wanted those presentations in your organizations, we're more than happy to do that. So thanks for attending. We are on time. We're about 6 or 7 minutes early. And look forward to next session of listening to Suzanne's presentation. Thanks again for joining.